Welcome everyone as we gather for our 7th session of Poets and the Faith at St. Peter's Eastern Hill. Tonight we gather to hear about the contemporary North American poet and prose writer Annie Dillard, led by local poet Wen Juan Lee. Wen Juan has asked that as we gather this evening, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, which of course we are happy to do. So as we gather, we acknowledge that we are gathering on the lands of the people of the Wurundjeri nations, and we pay our respect to their elders past and present. As we're gathering inside the church today, we also might acknowledge, we will acknowledge that we're gathering in sacred space due to an unforeseen circumstance in the hall, but quite a happy eventuality to gather in this beautiful space. So to begin with a prayer. To you, our dearest Creator and Redeemer, we give thanks for the life, space and company in which we dwell. We ask you to welcome and to grace us as we gather in your presence, that the words of our lips and the thoughts of our heart may be acceptable in your sight. To you be all glory, now and forever. Amen. So this talk will go for about 40 minutes this evening, and then we'll have a time of open question and reflection, during which I'll be roving around with a mic, so please raise your hand if you have a reflection or a question. If you need to use the restroom at any times during this session, then please do just catch the eye of one of our welcomers towards the back of the church, and they'll guide you towards them in the hall. Let's welcome Wen Juan.
Thanks, Catherine. Can you hear me? Is this... Okay, good. Oh, no, louder. Good, okay. So when I was first asked to speak for Poets and the Faith, the person that came to my mind was Annie Dillard. But when I was preparing the talk, I actually found it interesting in that Annie Dillard doesn't really fit these kind of neat categories of both poet, because she's kind of known more for her prose. She wrote 2 very small and unknown poetry books, one called Tickets for a Prayer Wheel and Mornings Like This, and another one called, Mornings Like This, sorry. And, but what actually catapulted her to acclaim was this book she wrote called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And she wrote that when she was very young, and she won the Pulitzer for it. The other reason that I found it interesting or difficult to fit her in the category of the faith is because she kind of circulates around Christianity. She's been Catholic, she was also Episcopalian, but she also brings in Islam, Hasidic Judaism, Taoism, and it's very common for her to have the Quran and the Bible in the same essay. So in this way, I think the talk might be a bit more unconventional, because I won't be reading poems, I'll be reading excerpts of her prose writing, but which I do think speak to a poetic mode of being. I think she pays attention to things at a word level. I might also begin with just an excerpt, just reading out an excerpt. It's not in your handout, but I do think if you're not familiar with Annie Dillard, it's good to familiarize yourself with the cadence and the style, and I think it also sets up how she approaches the world, which is quite intense sometimes, and she always looks at things with a lot of scrutiny. So this is from The Writing Life, where she's talking about, the art and practice of writing. Push it. Examine all things intensely and relentlessly. Probe and search each object in a piece of art. Do not leave it, do not course over it as if it were understood, but instead follow it down until you see it in the mystery of its own specificity and strength. Giacometti's drawings and paintings show his bewilderment and persistence. If he had not acknowledged his bewilderment, he would not have persisted. Admire the world for never ending on you, as you would admire an opponent without taking your eyes from him or walking away. One of the few things I know about writing is this: spend it all, shoot it, lose it all right away every time. Do not hoard what seems good for a later place in the book or for another book. Give it all, give it now. The impulse to save something good for a better place later is the signal to spend it now. Something more will arise for later, something better. These things fill from behind, from beneath, like well water. Similarly, the impulse to keep to yourself what you have learned is not only shameful, it is destructive. Anything you do not give freely and abundantly becomes lost to you. You open your safe and find ashes. After Michelangelo died, someone found in his studio a piece of paper on which he had written a note to his apprentice in the handwriting of his old age. Draw, Antonio, draw. Antonio, draw and do not waste time. So there are two kinds of seeing, a straining and a letting go. With Annie Dillard, she enacts both. Sight is a matter of ethics. To live a good life, a meaningful life, you must watch and you must wait. What I'm talking about here is not physical seeing, but metaphysical attentiveness. Her Notes of Observing Nature in Virginia, published in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, is one of tracking wildlife with a certain silent intensity, but it is also contingent. Something happens and she has placed herself in its path. Everything scatters and gathers, she writes. Everything comes and goes like a fish under a bridge. You have to stalk the spirit too. You can wait forgetful anywhere, for anywhere is the way of his fleet passage. Dillard wrote this in the context of Moses asking God to show him his face. A cliff in the rock here, a mountaintop there, and the rest is denial and longing, she writes. The subtitle to her collection of essays, Teaching a Stone to Talk, is Expeditions and Encounters. This is telling, I think, to what she speaks to in all of her writing. An encounter being something that you cannot plan, something that happens to you by grace, the anywhere of his fleet passage, or an expedition in which we will ourselves to see, to follow the Spirit out into the world, straining to see flashes of God. The philosopher Iris Murdoch believed in this too, that we could train our visions to see reality with a just and loving gaze. She called this paying attention. Simone Weil said something similar years earlier, that to pay attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Echoing Thoreau, Dillard said of writing Pilgrim, I tried to be a transparent eyeball. The partition between her and the world is very thin. Sometimes her descriptions become so dense, so circular and charged with meaning, you find yourself lost. This is her describing a copperhead snake. It tapered to nothingness. Suddenly, the copperhead's tail seemed to be the most remarkable thing I had ever seen. I wished I tapered like that somewhere. What if I were a shaped balloon blown up through the tip of a finger? Here was this blood-filled, alert creature, this nerved rope of matter, really here instead of not here, splayed soft and solid on a rock by the slimmest of chances. It was a thickening of the air spread from a tip, a rush into being, eyeball and blood through a pinhole rent. On it goes. Eudora Welty said of these sentences, I honestly do not know what she is talking about at such times. Someone else called it speaking in tongues. Sometimes it feels like her sentences have been welded out of her by force, at other times as if something has possessed her, something is speaking through her. It isn't prayer, a writer said of Dillard's writing, it is grace. Perhaps it is both. It is this grace-like prayer that first struck me about her essays. They read like poems. I wanted to reproduce, Dillard wrote, on a larger scale, poetry's capacity for deep internal structures of meaning. You can tell a poet has written this. The same questions she asks of nature and of humans in her poetry collection, Tickets for a Prayer Wheel, accumulates in extended metaphors in her essays. The total eclipse is a kind of dying, a Sunday Mass is an expedition to the pole. So what Dillard begins doing in poetry, I think she perfects in her prose. I'll be focusing on this poetic or novelized nonfiction that people have said defies genres. It is what she is known for, and it is what people have called revelatory, ecstatic. It expands my notions of faith, of seeing, and it expands my notions of poetry too. What Annie Dillard sees in nature is God's presence, but also God beyond comprehension. I think this is why her writing circulates. She doesn't arrive at any special conclusion about the copperhead snake, but it is always the nothingness and the somethingness of its being that sticks in my mind. The tail that tapers at one end and balloons at the other. It is the sheer fact that it exists. Something was created that is mind-boggling, drilled down again and again. Life is the pinhole rent, the thing we do not own, but which is God-given to us. I know only enough of God, she writes, to want to worship him by any means ready to hand. This question of the Creator always underpins what Dillard witnesses of creation. I think this passage that I'm going to be reading out now is in your handout. What do we think of the created universe, spanning an unthinkable void with an unthinkable profusion of forms? Or what do we think of nothingness, those sickening reaches of time in either direction? Deus absconditus. Is this what we think happened? Was the sense of it there and God absconded with it, ate it like a wolf who disappears? God is subtle, Einstein said, but not malicious. It could be that God has not absconded, but spread to a fabric of spirit and sense so grand and subtle, so powerful in a new way that we can only feel blindly of its hem. I saw a mockingbird make a straight vertical descent from the roof gutter of a 4-story building. It was an act as careless and spontaneous as the curl of a stem. The answer must be, I think, that beauty and grace are performed, whether or not we will or sense them. The least we can do is try to be there. God is subtle. God has spread to a fabric of spirit and sense. Perhaps this is what underpins Dillard's circularity, the swoop of the mockingbird. To perceive the absolute is a movement that goes around and about, but never directly. I love the range in which Dillard makes God both big and small, spread to a fabric, which has a wonderful intricacy to it. When I read it, I think of fog or cloud, but also granular, the curl of a stem, a mockingbird's fall. If God is not hidden but subtle, then what I sense from Dillard is a desire to be this perfect witness, to keep her eyes open, that by bearing witness to creation, she can bear witness to God. But this desire, I think, can bring up a tension and a frailty that is always present in her writing. This tension is there when she visits the Galapagos Islands. She writes, "In the interval, my attachment to the islands had shifted, and my memories of them had altered the way memories do, like parti-colored pebbles rolled back and forth over a grating, so that after a time, those hard, bright ones, the ones you thought you would never lose, have vanished, passed through the grating, and only a few big, unexpected ones remain, no longer unnoticed, but now selected out of some meaning, large and unknown. Such were the Palo Santo trees." At a certain point, the brilliance of the world, those bright, shiny pebbles, the noise and life of the Galapagos, give way to something starker. Some would call it the kernel and truth of the spirit. For Dillard, what unexpectedly sticks is something mute and stark. The trees are the opposite of something you witness, but rather something that witnesses you. They are holy sticks, Dillard writes, watching all that we watch and growing in silence. Constantly, there are these two forces, what we will ourselves in the moment to witness as active agents of the world, and what is God-given, revealed to us, what happens to us whether we will it or we don't. This tension is also how Dillard writes about being put in the path of. She uses that sentence. In different essays, she uses that exact phrase, being put in the path of. She puts herself in the path of light, the spirit, a total eclipse. To put ourselves in the path of the total eclipse that day, we had driven 5 hours. Or, I cannot cause light. The most I can do is try to put myself in the path of its beam. There is something funny going on in the relationship between putting ourselves and the path of. The putting is deliberate, but the path is total, all-encompassing a beam of force. Writing is similar. You put yourself in the conditions for work to come out. The conditions are planned, but what comes out is not. You become someone passive, someone through which something else can beam through. You are simply in its path. To be put in the path of, one force meets the other. Perhaps it does not simply go through, but it meets resistance, matter. The other is surprised. There is friction, there is encounter. What is that thing, though, that Annie Dillard is encountering? Is it the subtlety of God in his creation? Is it the nothingness, the unknowability that Dillard says is in everything? Dillard is much more at home describing otherness than pointing to what exactly is present. In the same essay with the Palo Santo trees, she writes, "There is a vibrancy to the silence, a suppression, as if someone were gagging the world. But you wait, you give your life's length to listening, and nothing happens. The ice rolls up, the ice rolls back, and still that single note obtains. The tension or lack of it is intolerable. The silence is not actually suppression. Instead, it is all there is." She uses that phrase twice in the essay, "it is all there is." I don't think it's nihilistic to say there is silence underneath everything. On the same side of God's presence is God's incomprehensibility. On the same side, before Christ's resurrection, was Christ's passion, which ends with silence on the cross. Timothy Radcliffe said that in Jesus' ministry, Jesus liberates us with conversation. But in his passion, we see conversation disintegrating. The final silence of Jesus on the cross is a love that is beyond our words, beyond comprehension. This isn't a silence of nothing more to say, but too much to say. I think now of Dillard's vibrancy to the silence, that it isn't actually suppression, instead it is all there is. And I think that this is how her essays contain that awe and the mystery of nature, but also its violence, its pain, as if someone were gagging the world. The gift of silence is the fact that it cannot be owned, cannot be possessed, it stops short of our parameters. In Variations on the Right to Remain Silent, the poet Anne Carson describes the trial of Joan of Arc. The inquisitors wanted to pin down what Joan of Arc heard or saw of God. They asked her if the voices she heard were singular or plural, and she said, "The light comes in the name of the voice." "The light comes in the name of the voice" is a sentence that stops itself. Its components are simple, yet it stays foreign. We cannot own it. Like Homer's untranslatable moly, it seems to come from somewhere else, and it brings a whiff of immortality with it. I think how Dillard talks about silence is similar to what that poet Anne Carson is drawn to in the silence of Joan of Arc's speech. It isn't physical silence, but rather that what is being said is untranslatable. This is how Dillard can talk about the noise and the hum of nature as silent. The second time she uses that phrase, the silence is all there is, she writes, it is the Alpha and Omega, it is God's brooding over the face of the waters, it is the blended note of the 10,000 things. This is how, despite her prose, there is an edge of opaqueness to her language. It also explains why I find it so difficult to articulate what I see in Annie Dillard's writing that speaks explicitly of the faith. What feels Christ-like, God incarnate, is slippery or vague. Perhaps that's why I'm drawn to Dillard too. There is one passage, though, or a book, where Christ sits explicitly underneath Dillard's perceptions. This is Holy the Firm, and this is the really long passage that's in your handout. I'm going to drink some water, and then I'll read. Okay. Holy the Firm. Here is a bottle of wine with a label, Christ with a cork. I bear holiness splintered into a vessel, a very God, the semi-paternal silence, personal and brooding, bright on the back of my ribs. I start up the hill. Above me, the mountains are raw nerves, sensible and exultant. The trees, the grass, and the asphalt below me are living petals of mind, each sharp and invisible, held in a greeting or glance full perfectly formed. There is something stretched or jostling about the sky, which, when I study it, vanishes. Why are there all these apples in the world, and why so wet and transparent? Through all my clothing, through the pack on my back, and through the bottle's glass, I feel the wine. Walking faster and faster, weightless, I feel the wine. It sheds light in slats through my ribcage and fills the buttress vaults of my ribs with light pooled and buoyant. I am moth, I am light, I am prayer, and I can hardly see. Each thing in the world is translucent, even the cattle and moving cell by cell. I remember this reality. Where has it been? I sail to the crest of the hill as if blown up by the slope of a swell. I see blasted the bay transfigured below me, the saltwater bay, far down the hill past the road to my house, past the firs and the church and the sheep in the pasture, the bay and the islands on fire, and boundless beyond it, catching alight the unraveling sky. Pieces of the sky are falling down. Everything is whole and a parcel of everything else. I myself am falling down, or slowly lifting up. On the bay's stone shore are people among whom I float, real people, gathering of an afternoon, in the cells of whose skin stream thin-colored waters in pieces which give back the general flame. Christ is being baptized. The one who is Christ is there, and the one who is John, and the dim other people standing on cobbles or sitting on beach logs back from the bay. These are ordinary people, if I am one now. If those are ordinary sheep singing a song in the pasture. This is a passage so revelatory, and it's interesting, I think, that it is set with Dillard carrying communion wine up the hill. It starts in prose, but as Dillard ascends, everything in the world becomes finely tuned. Everything breaks into poetry. In another essay, Dillard had described the mountain as where you can heave your spirit into. The mountain, then, is that private side, that face of solitude where Jesus was transfigured. In this solitude, Dillard carries Christ on her back. She encounters Christ's grace in the Eucharist, and the world becomes unbearably alive. The mountain is raw nerves, the sky jostles, so what is sky and what is ground becomes displaced. Then there is that line. Why are there all these apples in the world, and why so wet and transparent? It reminds me of the syntax and cadence of T.S. Eliot's A Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock. It pushes you, it builds momentum, but it isn't comprehended, it is felt. With Christ's grace, the world is abundant, transparent, translucent. There is so much of it, and the barrier between Dillard and it becomes thin. Transparent and translucent are also words of light. Dillard is interested in light because of what it illuminates. The light falls into slats, into the buttressed vaults of Dillard's ribs, like the Eucharist that is interiorized. It becomes part of our body. Is it blasphemous to think that when we encounter Christ's grace, light is pulled in us? That we are illuminated in our nothingness? Is that why Dillard calls the blood of Christ holiness splintered, something spread, something disseminated by its breaking? Splintered, of course, is also what happens to wood. There is the light of Christ and also the cross of Christ. I am moth, I am light, I am prayer, and I can hardly see. Earlier in Holy the Firm, there is a moth that Dillard describes catching on fire, flying too close to a candle's flame. Its body at the point of its burning illuminates the book Dillard is reading. It is a description that covers 3 pages, and it is so heady that to read a fragment of it now, rather than as a whole, would be, I think, to do it an injustice. I am moth, I am light, I am prayer, and I can hardly see. Christ is at the center of this I am, the moth that burns and becomes the light, the blood of Christ that is holiness splintered. What does it mean to be the light at the point of its burning? Christians are used to the image of Christ as the sacrificial lamb, but Dillard makes this image small or ordinary again with the moth. It's also interesting, I think, that if Dillard encounters Christ's grace beginning with his solitude, that is, remembering Christ's passion through the Eucharist, then she ends with his baptism, that is, grace bestowed on us, or what Tish Harrison Warren called the naked self. Christ's baptism sits after a string of complicated descriptions. The bay is on fire, things are falling down or becoming lifted up. The material world doesn't quite make sense. What are the cells of whose skin stream thin colored waters in pieces? I have no clue what this is even describing. There is a clumsiness to the rhythm. The words are like marbles in my mouth. Out of this, Christ as being baptized juts out. Among what is dense, granular, incomprehensible is one simple sentence. It is the same as I am moth, I am light, I am prayer, and I can hardly see. It is almost as if Dillard's relationship to Christ or her perceptions of him can go around and about, but then when she stumbles upon him, Christ is simply there. The repetition of the phrase, the one who is Christ is there, and the one who is John, feels distinctly Christian, in that we believe in someone both specific and eternal. Christ is both the one who was and who is to come, and he is also the one who is there, as in a person baptized among ordinary people. This scene of baptism that we encounter is so understated that I forget that Dillard is describing the same moment where the skies open up and God's voice cries out, "This is my son, whom I love, with him I am well pleased." This is the moment God marks Christ as his beloved, yet Dillard's focus seems to rest on the ordinariness of this day, the gathering of an afternoon, she calls it, among other people standing on cobbles or sitting on beach logs back from the bay. This little detail, cobbles, beach logs, feel funny to me because Dillard is describing Christ where she is in Puget Sound. He is there among cobbles, beach logs, he is there in her specificity. The title Holy the Firm refers to this mystery, where esoteric Christianity posited a created substance which was lower than metals and minerals, but in touch with the absolute at the base. This is how Dillard can look down at her house and her church and those other nouns that seem so simple, sheep, bay, island, and in the markers of her life, see Christ covering it all. Importantly, those nouns are transfigured, redeemed by Christ. The bay is blasted, pieces of the sky fall down. Faith has this sense of iconoclasm, that what is falling down is also lifting up. What makes no sense can also make perfect sense. Christ is found specifically now, but also again and again into the eternal. I want to end with one more moment of grace by Annie Dillard, and one that centers on human interaction, grace that comes from what happens between each of us. Dillard is at Disneyland with a delegation of exiled Chinese writers. At one point, she discovers that one of the writers is missing. She writes, "Some people think that Chen Bai Chen, having been through 2 world wars, occupation, liberation, famine, the anti-writers campaign, and the Cultural Revolution, can probably handle Disneyland. In fact, as we learn later, he has calmly made his way to the park's exit and is waiting on a bench. Nevertheless, I am so happy to see him that I forget all the warnings in the guidebooks and hug him rather enthusiastically. As we part, I see disheartened that his enormous eyes are full of tears. So he had been upset to be lost in Disneyland. I was wrong. Of course he had been upset and was now relieved. Who wouldn't be? Later, however, I learned that Chen Bai Chen, on his own account, was not in the least ruffled by being lost in Disneyland, but the warmth of our relief and embraces when we joined him, that had moved him to tears. Chinese men lose no face by weeping." This interaction between Annie Dillard and Chen Bai Chen springs up after a stream of endearing miscommunications. Sweet Human Absurdity is a group of writers attempting to connect against the backdrop of the Cultural Revolution, historical conflict, in a theme park built on illusion and American nationhood. In the end, it is the smallness of both writers' gestures that cracks my heart open. It is interesting that Dillard ends with, "Chinese men lose no face by weeping." They have seen each other's faces, if only fleetingly. Christ is the one in which we see the true face of love, the face that we do not have to mask or protect ourselves from. To lose face is a Chinese expression, is to lose dignity, to be humiliated. What is lost in face is power, public perception, but what we truly long for is to be able to lose face and still to be loved for it. Christ embodies this paradox. In one of her early poems, Dillard writes, "Love holds him here. Love nails him to the world, this windy wood as to a cross." Love nails us to the world. It is what makes us alive. It is also what makes us suffer. In loving, we give up our power to dominate, to control, and we accept risk, that we might see each other truthfully, that we might suffer from it. Chen Bai Chen and Annie Dillard are strangers to each other and also estranged by the language of the other, but they see each other's faces, if just for a moment. Chen Bai Chen cries. He betrays something of himself. Dillard hugs. It is impulsive. She does not mean to do it. It has stayed with me, I think, because of how small and ordinary this interaction is, but also how poignant when a script is neglected and the other is forced to respond. The writer cries not because he is distraught, but because he is moved by the other's ability to care for him. What seems so present at every moment is this. Dillard writes, "I walk out. I see something, some event I'd otherwise have utterly missed and lost, or something sees me. Some enormous power brushes me with its clean wing, and I resound like a beaten bell. In seeing, we are seen. In being seen, grace brushes us, and we resound like a beaten bell. A bell rings. This is what it was made to do. It is as if Dillard is saying, our bodies were made to ring, struck by the enormous power and grace of God. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Wenjuan for a beautiful talk, which came across as something like a poetic piece of non-fiction in itself, about the poet Annie and poetic prose writer Annie Dillard. I particularly appreciate the way that you wove from speaking about a silence underlying everything in Annie Dillard's naked perception of reality to this experience of the wordlessness of the divine love, or the beyond words of the divine love. It was very beautifully wound together. We have quite a bit of time now for questions and comments, so I'll welcome those from the floor. If you could raise your hand and I will bring you a microphone, and then Wenjuan will have an opportunity to respond.
Ewan's my name. Thanks so much, that was a beautiful talk. It sounds like Annie was pretty freewheeling in both her approach to writing and her approach to religion. What were the other aspects of her life like? What were her relationships like and her work like? Did she approach those things with a similar openness?
Yeah, so she actually studied, I'm pretty sure, theology at uni. And what I'm thinking about when you say that is there's an essay by this writer called Alexander Chee, where he talks about what it was like to study under Annie Dillard. I think she was a professor at Syracuse. Well, sorry, I'm not going to say Syracuse. I'm going to say an American university. In that, she's very freewheeling, pretty much. She's like smoking outside, just being like really like loose, pretty much. But she was also very rigorous. Like she would say, you know, like highlight all the things that are the meat of the words and cut those bits and cut them out, pretty much, and then write around it again, if that makes sense. So I think she was, I would say unconventional in her life, and it was reflected, I guess, in her writing, yeah.
Is it on? Oh. Thank you, Wenjuan, for that paper. I'm going to have some reflections on the concept or the whole idea of being of poetry and of a poet, because you at the beginning you talk about Annie Dillard as, you know, she's published 2 books of poetry. Whereas when you read Annie Dillard, anything of Annie Dillard, it's all poetry. Everything's this, and this is where the word poetry gets in the way of what's really going on, which is this extraordinary engagement with language to say it. So on the one hand, you have silence, you can't say it. And she kind of says, I'm going to keep trying to say it. Right? So there's this whole kind of thing happening like that in all of her writing, and it's coming out in all sorts of different ways. One of my very favourite books of Annie Dillard is a book of found poems called, you've mentioned this already, Mornings Like This. A found poem is a very contemporary or modern thing in a way. It's the idea of taking a text, many of you here will be familiar with this, of taking a text, anything, just a piece of prose or any document whatsoever, and you only use the words that are in that text, and you cut them out and you arrange them into a poem. So you take the words and convert it into something that's quite often quite transformative and very amazing, and is saying something ironical or beautiful in ways that the original document cannot achieve. Right? So this entire book, and I recommend this for you to go and have a look at some of this found poetry of Annie Dillard's, because it's absolutely amazing and very beautiful. You can reread them all the time. And I'm mentioning this because recently I've been rereading Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which is her very famous first book, in a way. And what I noticed was how many quotes there are in it. So she's talking about going and living in the country, and it's about nature, and it is about God. It's about being, there's an incredible, and it's about the seasons and that kind of thing. But all the way through it, there are these incredible, she's full of quotation, which you don't notice. But she doesn't use quotation in the way of, so-and-so said this and I agree. It's like a found poem, only she's got all this other stuff going all around. So there's all this quotation happening all the way through that is elevated. She takes the quotes and elevates the meaning in the context of whatever, like it can be the copperhead snake, anything that she's wanting to, the splinters, the bottle of wine, all these things that are going on, that she's looking at very, very attentively. And what I'm getting at here is that she's totally fixated with words and language and how to make that happen. And so she's trying all sorts of different experiments to see how you can get through to talking about things as difficult as God in whatever language or what method is available to her. Fascinating.
Thanks for that comment, Philip. That was wonderful. Yeah. I think there was a question up here, and I'll come back to you. There was someone up here who'd raised their hand. Do you want to? If you could just say your name at the start of your response. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Misa.
Hi, Misa.
I just wanted to ask if there's anything from Annie Dillard's writing that inspires your own writing in forms of like technique or styling.
Wait, sorry, can you say that again?
I was wondering if there's any writing techniques or stylings from Annie Dillard's work that inspires your own writing.
I think, I guess what Philip has said in terms of she uses a lot of different texts, like in Mornings Like This, she uses like an encyclopedia for some kind of, I think it's like a health encyclopedia or something, or like Van Gogh's letters, I think she uses. I think she uses a lot of like interesting, found text or theories, which definitely inspire my own writing in terms of just having kind of non-fiction in a way that's maybe a bit more like novelized. I think there's like one book that she writes for the time being, where she talks a lot about this paleontologist, Teilhard de Chardin, who some of you might know, because he was also a Jesuit. And it's like, she talks about like, combines his work in a very, very specific way, because ultimately it's like, yes, he's a paleontologist, but it's, and in a way he's looking at time and uncovering time, and that is at a very granular level as well in terms of dust. So I think the thing that she's able to do very well is to combine things that feel almost scientific or inaccessible in a way that then feels poetic. And she's had that with like light as well. You know, you see her obsession with light. and she says something about it being, she says something like, light is both, oh my gosh, what is it? It's both a wave and or like something about solar wind, and solar wind being kind of driven by the sun and how it can be invisible, things like that. So obviously they seem kind of abstract, but then you can also understand it on some kind of conceptual level. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. Oh. Yeah. Yeah, I think I don't know a lot about her biography, to be quite honest with you. I mean, I think, I know what she kind of experienced via her books, and she writes about it in An American Childhood as well, which is her fiction. But from what I know, from the things that from what I've read by her, she is, she spent a year at, in Virginia, which is where she wrote Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. She's always been, I think, very fascinated by nature. She's a naturalist. She studied divinity before that, and then she wrote Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. She also went to Puget Sound, which is a very kind of far-off place, quite isolated, and it was there in this kind of remote region that she wrote Holy the Firm, which is the book that passage that I read at the last section, which she has herself said was a mystery, how she wrote that. She said all of the sentences that she wrote were very strange and almost hostile when she wrote it. So I think, I don't know if I can really speak to her biography because it's not something that I'm actually familiar with.
Are there other questions? Thank you. Yes, Philippa.
I'm Philippa, and I was struck quite early by your reference to a point, making, in a sense, I had a sense of making oneself, exposing oneself, making oneself available to the grace of God. And the phrase that from Four Quartets that kept coming back to me was the still point of the turning world. Eliot, the last of the Four Quartets. And I couldn't help but think, somehow, when she was talking of the effect of the copperhead's tail, somehow there, in that moment, that point, you had to be there and be exposed to it, and then God would make him or herself available and to you in grace. There, if you were there at that point, somehow it was as though I had to place myself there and be there and be there and be exposed and be open, and then the grace of God would make itself known, much as the copperhead's tail unfurled and made itself known to her.
Do you have a response? Or thank you, Philippa. That's beautiful.
Yeah, I think that is the thing that draws me to her, is that sense of, she will really focus on that one point, like you said, or extend this kind of image and make it something that's really potent, I would say. And that sense of the putting herself in the path of, or in that point, I think, has that element of why she always wants to be, I guess exposed and to see everything, so that things can happen to her. But yeah, I guess that's kind of where it's hard, because sometimes you can't always be everywhere and you can't always keep your eyes open to things. And so that's kind of where Grace kind of, I guess, comes in, and which she sometimes hints at. But I do think she has a kind of an intensity to her, and to being like, I guess, exposed or unarmored, or yeah.
Thank you. Are there other... Yes.
Thanks, Wenjuan. I haven't looked at Annie Dillard for some time, but I found what you are saying has inspired me to go back and reread, particularly The Writing Life and The Holy Firm. And you've helped me clarify that idea she has of fixity and looking at life honestly. Her passage of the moth and the fire, like there's fire in the moth, literally, and it's a kind of a call to look at life honestly in all its pain, to keep our gaze fixed on the point. But also it's, I remembered how she talks about in The Writing Life, she'll spend a whole morning on a paragraph, and then the afternoon she'll just completely take it away. And so there's that, but also you've reminded us of her idea of putting yourself in the way of, and she has this wonderful, again, it might be in The Writing Life, where she goes into the university at night so she can really concentrate and it's dark, and there's a chessboard, and she moves a piece, and she comes back the next night and she sees another piece has been moved. So she gets into this thing night after night of playing chess with an unknown person. And it all turns out to be, in the end, a toddler who has no idea what the toddler's doing and just completely upends the whole board. So it's putting yourself in the way of the spirit, no matter what the spirit's going to bring up. So it's her idea of like looking and being faithful and in the moment and being honest, but also being completely open to whatever the universe is tossing one's way. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Carol. I think you've also brought up a really good point about, which I haven't talked about at all, which is her humour. Like, she's just a very, very funny writer. And she's able to look at things, like the chessboard where it's like so intense, and it's likened to writing. And then at the end, it's like, oh, you've been playing with a baby. Like, the baby doesn't know what game you're in. Like, and similar with I think there's just so many parts. Like the one that she, Expedition to the Pole, which again I didn't cover, but which is probably one of my favorite essays, is her attending mass, and she just has these incredible descriptions about mass essentially, and you can see the humor, and it's always dealt with I think tenderness, and it's always very endearing. I think she's very humanist in that way, but you kind of have a sense of like life, or I don't know, you feel good about it because you can see so specifically all of those little nuances that she's able to pick up in that we might not pick up because we go to mass all the time or whatever it is.
A question in this direction? Okay.
Thank you so much. On that point of humour, I really liked the way she described trees as holy sticks. Does she have similar, almost irreverent turns of phrase about other natural phenomena?
Oh, let me think. She has this one, it's not irreverent, but she it's at Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, very at the beginning, where she talks about the tomcat that would paw her at night, and then she says that she'd wake up with these bloody kind of footprints, pretty much. And I think all of it is setting up this kind of weird idea of like, yeah, I guess nature is also being violent in some ways, or that you have to kind of grab at. Yeah, that's the only thing that comes to my mind, but I'm sure there's more. I will let you know.
Hands up for other questions or comments.
Hi, Wenjun. Thank you so much. I have a question regarding the last one that you read. And it's the part about the wine and the ribs. And that part just made me wonder if she's also talking about the Eucharist and the giving away of the blood of Christ in the wine. I don't know, what's your opinion about that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good reading of it. Yeah, that she is, there's the kind of sense of, I think, something that is, yeah, like interiorized, or that is both given, you know, how we administer, is all kind of likened to the Eucharist, but not in the words or in the vocabulary that we know. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Sean, I'm going to come round.
Thanks so much. I just had a question about actually following on from that question. You mentioned that she was also a reader of Islam and Judaism and other spiritualities. So I thought the way that Christian metaphysics and her metaphysics ribboned together throughout your talk was very beautiful. And I wondered if there are sort of identifiable metaphysics of these other religions that sort of come to mind when you're thinking of her writing, if they ribbon through as well.
She often, yeah, threaded metaphysics is very, I would say the thing that comes to my mind is that in the way she talks about prayer, that is often, that can be, she does use a lot of Islam and Judaism, and there is a quote, there's a part I remember where she talks about a rabbi saying something like saying goodbye to all of his loved ones before he goes off to pray. And they go, why are you saying that? And he says, because there's a gap between me invoking God's name and me then saying, have mercy on me. And in that gap, God could, like, who knows what will happen in that moment, in that gap, right? So I think she will use that often with pretty much most religions, like that idea of the kind of awe of God and also the nature of prayer that is both risky and at the same time ordinary. Yeah, I think so. I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of other examples as well. Yeah.
I think that was a good answer.
Sorry, I just, yeah.
Very concrete.
I will, yeah, anyway.
No, that was brilliant. Did you have a question as well? No? Comment? Okay. Well, that will probably conclude our proceedings for tonight, but thank you all again for gathering in this space, and thank you again to Wenjun for speaking to us and breaking open the poet Annie Dillard for us. Maybe another round of applause here. stay tuned because next month we have one of our own, Nelson Rufat, also addressing us on the poets T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden. So that promises to be very special as well. As we conclude tonight, do feel free to stay to finish your drinks, and we'll be quietly packing away up the back. And otherwise, thank you all for coming.